Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our BPF webinar series this week, and very timely in Mental Health Week, focusing on mental health. I'm joined by a stellar panel who I will invite to introduce themselves very briefly as I bring them in. But I'm sure we're going to have an engaging and hopefully not a challenging, but also a positive conversation over the next 3/4 of an hour or so, as we look at all the various different issues around the particular challenges of focusing on and dealing with mental health during coronavirus crisis, but also trying to look longer term as well, to a time when our lives, we rediscover more normal lives, shall we say. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Juliet Smithson first to come in and just give us a take of what you're seeing across your role, which I'll invite you to also introduce as you come in.
Thanks, Melanie. So I'm head of operations for the RICS Benevolent Fund, more known as Lionheart. In the first few days when COVID started to hit and it became apparent that this was going to be something significant that we were going to have to deal with, we did see a surge in calls. That settled when the support for employed and self-employed was announced. And we've now settled to about 40% up on call volumes, handling calls on a variety of things that affect the surveying profession. The obvious ones are things like jobs. People are really worried about their jobs and the fallout in the industry, across the industry. Some were concerned that their employers can't or won't make the necessary changes to make, particularly as we think about going back to work and how we're going to open up the industry and open up business again. There are concerns that people are worried about going back. They've been told for weeks now that leaving the house is a dangerous and risky thing to do. And now we're wanting them to tempt them out. I think we need to address how we're going to manage that fear. People are fearful that their employers might not or can't or won't make workplaces safe. And the other thing we're seeing is some concern around homeschooling and how if that continues to September, how are people going to manage that? How are they going to maintain that work-life balance? I think we've all been surviving doing that for a number of weeks, but if that becomes months, that's a slightly different problem to address. And then I know that there are lots of concerns around loss and grief and how that's not really possible to process that in a current time when funerals are quite short and quite challenging in terms of numbers. Just a few people, very very brief moments to say goodbye to someone, and a lot of people are processing loss and grief. But there's a real appetite for change as well. I think people are wanting to come out of this experience it different.
Thanks, Juliet. And Alex Note, I'm going to bring you in next, and I lots there that we'll come back to and explore further. But I know that a particular chord from our conversation before we started the webinar might have been struck with you around that homeschooling and those childcare issues, because I think that's something you're experiencing as you try and juggle your work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melanie. And I think, the thing, a few people may have seen this already online, but, I don't think this is homeschooling. This is not an active choice to decide to take our children home and, and run their education. This is crisis education alongside trying to juggle all the kind of many balls in the air as we adapt to this kind of new reality. And that's incredibly difficult. And I'm very fortunate that my daughter, I have one child, and that, her school has been very supportive, and my husband and I can kind of try and juggle that. But has been phenomenally challenging for all of us, and all the stresses and strains that, we are finding and adjusting to running our lives through webinars and screens and endless Zoom or Teams calls. It's even harder for young children who are not necessarily used to want to just play physically. So I think there's that real pressure of, adjusting to a life through a screen, and the need to try and maintain that socialization that children and that people, need and used to take for granted, and how we retain those connections. And loneliness and isolation, I think, are things that, we really, really need to focus on. I'm a renowned pedant, so I have a real issue with a lot of the semantics around the way that we've been talking around the crisis. So, I don't like the term social distancing. I think we should talk about physical distancing, because that's actually what we're trying to do, and we need social connections more. I've never really liked work-life balance, because I think that implies a kind of either or. And I think all of us, even before this crisis, have been, juggling with the reality of 24/7 technology means you're kind of, that always on pressure is there. So it's, for a lot of people, it's more of a work-life blend. And, it's very personal as to what the right balance of that is. But, I don't think it's kind of set of scales. So what I would like to see that we can get to, both as a kind of industry, but also as a society, is, where flexible working used to just be really for women. It used to be seen as a parenting thing. And I think now I'm saying that everybody can work flexibly now, but that all of us need a bit of bandwidth. And it might be for our own sort of our self-sanity. It might be for caring responsibilities, whether for children or for elderly relatives. It might be for a litany of other things. But actually, that it can be, flexible working is not a trade-off of lesser working in some way, that actually it's dynamic working. So that's the one real kind of positive thing I think we can try and take forward out of this, is that we can see that everybody, at every stage of career, has learned that you can work like this. And how do we take that forward in a way that is still positive and constructive and social?
Thank you. Lots of positive energy there, as well as challenges, which is really good. And we'll come back to that too. Priya, I'm going to bring you in a second. Before I do that, I should have said at the start, and I will rectify my error by saying, please do use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panel, and I will pick them up as we go through. But while you're thinking of your questions and writing them down, I'll turn, Priya, to you. And I guess one of the issues is, that this is impacting very differently on different communities and different parts of society. And, we just need to be really thoughtful and mindful of that, alongside all of the other issues that have already been talked about with Juliet and Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who may not know, I'm Priya Shah, founder of BAME in Property, which is an organisation to help bring more ethnic diversity to the property and planning sectors. And my day job is working in built environment comms. So I'm kind of coming in with both hats on, but at the moment, really want to focus on the diversity aspect of it, because I think what we're seeing at the moment is almost like a two-tier system between the haves and the have-nots. And what we're seeing is quite a lot of people from BAME backgrounds, don't necessarily live in working environments where they can work from home. So you get quite a lot of BAME families, especially from Asian and Black families who live in multi-generational households. So they often have grandparents, cousins, multiple children all running around the household, which makes working from home really difficult. And adding to that, if you don't have the correct internet infrastructure, it makes it even more difficult to try and kind of spread that internet bandwidth all across different devices and so on. So that makes it really difficult. But adding to that is the additional stress of trying to isolate grandparents if they are vulnerable or if they're unwell, trying to manage the homeschooling, which Alex has already touched upon. That's almost like a universal issue for anyone who has children, not just BAME people or otherwise. But also at the moment, what we've had is Ramadan. And, there are people out there who are fasting, which, in usual circumstances, which would be a very communal thing that they would be doing. So they would be eating together, praying together, breaking their iftar together, going to mosque together, all of these things which are just not able to happen at the moment. And if you do have Muslim employees or colleagues, they are observing Ramadan a lot differently this time. And it's the added stress of doing this from home, doing this when you are, more flexibility is required. It's probably a little bit more emotional for them, because they're not able to celebrate it how they'd normally like to. At the same time, there might be positives. They don't have to actually commute into work, which takes away that stress and that exhaustion which comes with not eating or drinking all day. So I think, there are some silver linings, but all in all, we do need to be more mindful of people who do live in different circumstances to us. And I think the final thing that I want to touch upon is just the key stats that we're seeing amongst BAME communities with regards to COVID cases and deaths. We are seeing a higher proportion of deaths amongst BAME communities, not just because they are health workers and because they are key workers, but because they are just more exposed to the virus because of circumstance out of their control, whether it's to do with their environment, whether it's to do with exposure to pollution, their occupation and so on. I think that really does need to be considered. Just within my own household, my parents are key workers and they actually have to go out to work, whereas my brother and I are, working from home. We are safe at home. And I think that needs to be acknowledged, that working from home is a privilege that a very small minority can actually enjoy and be safe to do so. So yeah, those are just some of the areas that I'll be touching upon during this session.
Thanks, Priya. And Jenny, last but by no means least to you, and I guess another very challenged community by all of this is the student community. Huge impact for them. So, but share your own experiences too. But to talk to us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. So yes, I'm Jenny Shaw. I'm Student Experience Director for Unite Students, a student accommodation company. We do have a very large and diverse workforce across the country, so absolutely recognise all the issues that have been raised so far. But yeah, particularly in terms of students who are our customers, it is an area that's received quite a lot of media attention over the last few years, and it has been described as a bit of a crisis in terms of student mental health, and this definitely hasn't helped. So what we've seen we do have students still living with us. Many have gone home, but we do have those still living with us, and it has really, I think, brought to light some of the inequalities. So those who are living with us still are those who are unable to go home, perhaps because they're international students, or actually the student accommodation is a better environment for them than their parental home for various reasons. And so, that kind of highlights some of the inequalities. Students maybe who have been in care, or who have, families where they're not necessarily safe, or just would be going back to a very overcrowded home without the technology and the support that they need to do what they need to do. That does put them at a lot of risk of isolation. So we've been having to do quite a lot of work sort of with students to help them connect and to make sure they're supported. There's also quite a lot of concern about next year's cohort. So amongst ourselves, but also more widely in the higher education sector, that actually here is a cohort going to university. All those rites of passage have been stripped away. They're not doing their exams. They're not able to say goodbye to their friends in the normal way. The start of term is going to be very uncertain. Some of it may be online or blended learning. They're not going to get that transition, their freshers week and so on. And actually they may be coming in and bringing in with them quite a lot of trauma and unhappiness because of the things that they've seen throughout this crisis. So there is a bit of a concern about what might be coming next year and the impact that might have on that cohort of students.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maybe stick with that theme and think a bit more and talk a little bit more about some of those kind of medium-term impacts, sort of looking ahead to whether it's the start of the next academic year or whether it's sort of a return to offices. And we're seeing obviously quite a lot of announcements from major employers about their expectations about what their office space requirements will be in the future. We know there are already lots of changes happening in the retail sector that are being accelerated by all of this, and not everybody and every business will make it through, and they may be operating very differently and have very different requirements going forward. So how long do we think this is going to be felt for, and how do you think our sector sort of starts to think about and react to some of those changes? I mean, Jenny, you touched on sort of the issues that may be facing the student population and universities and private providers of accommodation in the next academic year. What are some of the practical things you're starting to think about that might change the way that you provide services to students? Have you sort of got to sort of the stage yet where you've got sort of those ideas shaped, or are you still in the process of forming them?
Yeah, we do. I mean, I think just more widely, this crisis is making us think differently about place. Which obviously is an issue, huge issue in the property sector. I think probably for us, we feel a little more protected than some, because there is such a strong drive for young people to go away to university that we believe that if they possibly can, they will still want to do that. But yes, we are thinking about what it's going to look like next year. So we've been thinking a lot about how we digitise a lot of our services, which we do to an extent anyway. So we always tend to express the service we provide in terms of the end result rather than the process. So we're thinking about, okay, what's a different way to get to that? What's a different way of providing that service? So that's been a real focus. But also, how can we provide a compliant space in terms of the requirements that may be in place in September. We don't know what they will be, the social distancing. So what do we need to put in place? How are we going to manage the social distancing? How are we going to provide, just on a practical level, how are we going to provide thousands and thousands of hand sanitizers to be used across the whole of the estate and so on, and actually to get that in place now and to make a really clear statement about it so that students and their parents feel reassured and safe to come, because we think they do want to come. A lot of universities are saying we're going to put lectures online, but actually they're still expecting students to come because there will be small group teaching, there'll be some level of social interaction, and students are still going to want to come to university. So how do we make that feel like a safe option for them?
Yeah. And Melanie, I think that place point that Jenny makes is actually something we're really actually seeing. My role covers a lot of the kind of placemaking that we do on very large scale kind of residential led regeneration projects. And we have a large one in Bristol that we're working on with our partners Cubex, and we were already talking about future proofing and best kind of digital and fibre, knowing that people are working from home more. What this has really illuminated for us is, particularly in Bristol, but I think it's everywhere, is the point that Priya made around digital poverty, which is something that I don't think we've ever really kind of considered properly. But if you are in a household of 8, 10, 12 people with a couple of phones, or no laptops or tablets, and people are just blithely assuming that you can access remote learning, whether you're a student or a school pupil or work from home, and not only do you not have the physical space, but you don't have the equipment to do that. So that's something that is actively changing the way that we're writing our master plan at the moment, and what we're trying to think about how we build in kind of digital equalization points actually for everybody across the site. So that's kind of, again, another positive. And I think it's the challenge around some things that Jenny has highlighted, that people may not assume that students, if you've got to university, people tend to assume that there's a kind of a luxurious position there in some ways, but food poverty is something else that we're really, really seeing. And I know that in Bristol, there's a charity called Fair Share that we do a lot of work with, and 1 in 4 children in Bristol, they like to go hungry just pre-crisis over the summer holidays because they're so dependent on schools for access to food. So actually that rolling out into kind of constrained family circumstances across all generations is something we've really got to think much more commonly about. How do we ensure that people have safe access to everything that they need?
Yeah. And Priya, we're not, as we all know, yet as diverse an industry as we would like to be, and a number of us are working very hard to try and change that, with you, of course, first and foremost in that. But how do we therefore, as an industry, both take the kind of challenge that Alex has laid out there, and that sort of rethinking of what's most important to build into our placemaking, but also make sure we're properly informed by the issues facing some of the more marginalised communities that you were talking about. How are we going to do that in practice, and how do we get their voices heard better?
Sure, thank you. Well, I think there is a big role for different types of engagement. So this is where I kind of come in with my other hat on, because I work in the engagement sector as well. So we often go out to very hard to reach communities. There's a huge role for online engagement. Obviously, for those who don't have access to the internet, it makes it really difficult. But there's some great platforms out there like Commonplace, Built ID. And what I really like about Built ID is that you can answer questions online on an app, so really easy to do on your phone, but also give to local charities, which I think is really important, because people will often be more engaged if they get something out of it, or if they can give back to their local community as well. So I think that's really, really key. And just being a bit more creative with your online engagement, or just general community engagement as well. So we're working with a big developer at the moment where we've been doing virtual events over Zoom, and this was part of our original plan, was to actually do like a food for thought event where we invited people to have a big lunch, where we would discuss the plans for this big plan over food. But we couldn't do that because of COVID-19 and the physical distancing restrictions. So we actually just worked with a local restaurant in the area, sent them food to their homes, and they just connected with us over Zoom. So it was a really nice way of actually connecting with them during this kind of social isolation period, getting the feedback that we need, but also reaching groups that are often more difficult to reach reach anyway. So we've managed to get probably more feedback from groups than had we just done, your physical exhibition in your village hall. So I think that's been really nice. And I think, the engagement sector has always been quite slow to adapt, and just kind of planning in general. What we're seeing now is more virtual planning committees and things like that. But I think, COVID-19 has almost been the kind of mother of invention, in the sense that, we are using more creative and innovative ways of engaging with people. And we really do have to do this, because the only way we are going to build for the future and build for what people in communities actually want is by getting them to be involved in this process, really engaging in more co-designing and things like that. That's so important, because if we don't, then we are going to end up building homes which don't have balconies which are the right size, which don't have the right kind of internal structures, which are just not fit for purpose, which we've already seen throughout this crisis. We've got 10 people living in a 2-bedroom home, and that's just not fit for purpose, and we're just seeing it so much more now. So I think this is going to be a real spur for us to think about how we can involve more communities, and especially those who are impacted the most, such as BAME communities, more into the design process. And it goes without saying that, we need to have people who are representing those people in our industry. And I think one concern for a lot of BAME people, or people from more underrepresented backgrounds, is whether this is going to put a freeze on recruitment in our industry. Already people are being put on furlough or being made redundant. Are they going to be, brought back into the working environment? Is this going to have an impact on statistics for our industry with regards to gender balance and ethnicity as well? Is this really going to push back some of the progress that we've already made in trying to achieve a more equal sector? But I think now is more important than ever to ensure that we do have a diverse industry, to ensure that we are actually building for the future. So I think, it's just so important that we do actually bring these people in, but we acknowledge that there's going to be difficulties in bringing them in the first place. They don't have that access to information about our industry, which we were already having as an issue before this crisis. Going into schools and not really being presented with the options of being a chartered surveyor, for example, or working in the built-to-rent sector. We need to make sure that we're doing that more so now, because it's so important. There are new and innovative ways of doing that. We need to make sure that people do have those opportunities to have internships and things like that in our industry. It's more difficult when you're working from home, but they shouldn't be put on the back burner because it's difficult. We have to be creative and make sure that we do still, make those opportunities happen, because if people don't have that really vital experience, they're just not going to be able to get that foot into the door into our industry.
Thanks, Priya. And Juliet, I can see you nodding your head vigorously there. So do come in on that, but also I'd be particularly interested to hear from you as to, within the industry, there are a lot of people with all of the uncertainties and worries that Priya's talked about, but also being challenged to sort of put themselves in other people's shoes and reinvent the product and the service that they're offering to customers. And, that will put a huge strain, I think, on the people within our industry. So how do we look after them in that process? Be really interested to hear your views on that.
I think Priya picked up something about necessity is the mother of invention, and I think we are really central in that right now. I think firms who perhaps have had wellbeing as a tick box, as a kind of opportunity to kind of win an award or look like they're doing the right thing, have suddenly sensed the need for it and have to bring it into the heart of delivering across the whole spectrum of their business, because they've needed to engage people who are there unfortunately having to furlough. They're having to support people who are going through a mass experiment in home working and exploring new ways of working. I think it's driven a huge surge in flexibility, which hopefully will help diversity as well, particularly around bringing women into senior positions if flexible working is the new norm, because we're in a society-wide experiment right now of flexible working. It's going to be very difficult for employers to turn around in 6 months' time and turn down flexible working requests when there's clear evidence that it's working. We're all productive. And I think it's a good opportunity for employers to actually sound out their staff about how do they want to work? What is that elusive work-life blend, as Alex puts it so well? What do they want? Because maintaining your staff in the best performing position they can be in is going to be increasingly important. I think there's also been a push around mental health more widely. I think people who perhaps have always felt that mental health challenges were something other people had and something that didn't affect them might have been challenged during this pandemic. They might have found that they have struggled with stress and anxiety themselves, where they always thought they were immune to that. And hopefully that will drive some openness around that topic, and also some solutions that enable people to bring their whole self to work, and for companies to operate with staff who understand that day-to-day mental health it's not a fixed thing. It's a flux. You can have good days, you have bad days, you may move seamlessly between those during the week, and that's okay. And hopefully firms and companies will provide solutions that enable staff to manage that and to stay well at work, stay well as their whole self at work.
And are you optimistic that our industry will rise to that challenge and embrace that culture? Because we're not, I think, known for the flexibility of certainly parts of the sector approach to work and work-life balance and so on. I mean, will we seize the opportunity, do you think?
I think there is evidence that I have heard from employers who are tentatively taking steps to be more flexible to and certainly around well-being. We've had approaches from firms to support their well-being functions, to particularly around staff that are being furloughed. So I do think there is some cause for optimism in the industry.
I'd like to give a shout out, if I may, because one of the reasons that I joined sort of Places, People and PFP Capital was it was a real kind of outlier pioneer in terms of understanding flexible working for me. And I don't live in London, but I travel around, so that was important. But actually that we have had for some time, we have a fantastic lady called Anne Gardner-Aston, who is our Group Health and Safety and Wellbeing Director. And it's really crucial to know that she manages all of that. So, her job right now is mind-boggling because it's dealing with all kind of the PPE for all of our construction teams, and the frontline services in our social care businesses and our social housing, as well as the well-being. And she has a huge program of training mental health first aiders in all of our office teams. But that's been in our business for a couple of years now, and I think it's shown real value. So I think we as an organisation have got past exactly what Juliet says, that sort of tokenism of, we need to like some wellbeing points to win an award or to sound like we're doing it. And I think you can see in various awards there are companies that have really embedded it and are seeing the business benefit, the same way that Priya's shown all the kind of diversity is a strength, diversity leads to better business. And you can finally gradually start to see evidence on that. And I think that is the case for wellbeing and for sustainability. And all the things that have been seen as sort of discretionary extras, they're really not. They're really, really core. And, I think you can see one of the reasons that I'm really, really proud of Places for People, our frontline staff have made 37,000 calls to customers, for particularly vulnerable customers in our social housing portfolio, and had such incredible feedback and response, have been really proactive. And the fact that those calls have been made by people who've never really worked from home themselves. Most of them have been in kind of call centres or in like major offices, and that we've managed to get them all kitted up to do that, and they've been supported to provide the support that's needed to the front line. I think that's that's eminently adoptable by all sorts of different kinds of organisations across our industry. And I think you can see some of the big REITs and some of the big investors are starting to talk the language now. I think, as Juliet pointed out, there's lessons that they can pick up. They don't need to reinvent the wheel.
I think there's also something about culture change that's already gone on in the broader property industry. I'm thinking particularly about construction, and how the attitude towards health and safety has changed over the last few decades, and that has been wholesale culture change, contractor by contractor, subcontractor by subcontractor change. So there is as an industry, there's a huge amount of experience in delivering big picture culture change that should put the industry in a much better position to address some of the well-being challenges that we're facing right now.
Jenny, you'd like to think that a student accommodation provider had a flexible approach, given your customer base has a fairly sort of flexible lifestyle at times. But what's your experience?
In terms of providing flexibility?
In terms of whether you think the culture is changing in the industry, and whether within your business, you feel like flexibility is embraced and is an opportunity rather than a challenge?
I think it's changed. I think it's changed fundamentally, and I think it's changed very quickly over the last few years. So I think particularly flexibility of the understanding of what it entails. So the Student Wellbeing Good Practice Guide that the BPF published last year, I think was an absolute landmark to say, look, once and for all, student accommodation providers have a huge role to play in student mental health, which now looking back on it, you think was really obvious, but it really wasn't at the time. It wasn't very well acknowledged within the higher education sector as a whole. There was a kind of a feeling that, well, landlords have got no business doing anything like this. But actually what it did is it brought out all the different ways in which a landlord could be supporting mental health and actually responding to the mental health needs of students and actually averting, some pretty horrible situations by their actions. So I think that was a really important piece of work and really happy to have been a part of that. I think more widely, I think this crisis is challenging everyone on flexibility, isn't it? The way people go to university hasn't really changed for 800 years. So, and now we're starting to think, well, is this the point at which it may change? And actually, over the last few years, we've kind of been monitoring this. It is a very, very stable model, but we do need to be ready to respond if there is some flex in that, if there's flex in terms of, the periods of time in which students want to be in residence. As does it open up university to different groups of potential students who may want somewhere to live for parts of the year, for example? So there's new opportunities there as well. But it does challenge us. It does fundamentally challenge the status quo, doesn't it, in every area of life?
Yeah. We're coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to come around to each of you in a minute to ask you, the theme of Mental Health Week is kindness. I'm going to ask you each for sort of one example, whether it's from within your businesses, whether it's something you've seen of our industry demonstrating kindness to our customers. But in order to give you time to think, it's only fair that I lead off. So I'm going to give a shout out to Landaid. So I'm a Landaid trustee as well as chief executive of the BPF. And Landaid launched an appeal to try and do what it could do to play a part in supporting people through COVID-19. And obviously Landaid has a particular focus on youth homelessness, so the particular focus was around young people and keeping them safe. And we've had an incredible response from the industry to that appeal. In a very small number of weeks, we have raised over £750,000 and we are heading towards the target of £1 million by the end of June that we set ourselves. So, huge shout out to Landaid, and please do support them if you're not aware of their fantastic work they do. And I think that does show our industry rising to a challenge. But now I've given you all a bit of time to think. I'm going to come to Alex first because she's nodding the most vigorously. Sorry, Alex.
That's all right. No, I'm on the board for Landaid in the Southwest, so I completely endorse that. And one of the fun things that, you see lots of those the frontline charities that Landaid supports, their funding's completely been devastated. But we did, the property plank challenge has been great fun. So holding a 90-second plank, and I've nominated lots of people to do that, and it's been great fun to see lots of friends and colleagues do that in different ways. There's also an initiative that was set up by Deborah Udolph at Say Property and a number of others, Adina David at Greystar, called Do Some Good. And initially it was about focusing on the fact that lots of us who would normally have gone to MIPIM, might have had a bit of time in our diaries and could actually have done some kind of volunteering. And actually they had such an overwhelming response to that they were able to then, as well as pairing up people with kind of specific volunteering opportunities, have been able to mushroom that into coordinating the donation of space, accommodation for NHS workers and that kind of thing. So, the Do Some Good initiative is really one that I'm really proud to see lots of friends just pick up and run with, and it's partnering with Landaid and lots of other charities. So again, it's always nice to see where there's not duplication, it's actually integrated. But I'd really recommend that.
Thank you. Priya.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute there. I want to mention a couple of things. The company I work for, Grayling, we usually get fruit delivered to our London office a few times a week, and it's so much fruit because there's nearly 200 of us in that office. And obviously, as soon as the working from home restrictions came into place, we didn't want to stop our fruit deliveries, put the kind of small fruit supply out of business. So we actually continued to pay, or rather Grayling continued to pay for the fruit supplies to actually go to hospitals, food banks. And over the last few weeks, we've had such nice messages from the fruit supplier with photos from hospitals, charities, all just saying how grateful they are to have this fruit, because everyone's been donating so much to NHS charities and just, hospital workers and our key workers in general. But it's just so nice to see their gratitude. And we obviously are just so happy to be able to give them that support and also keep the local fruit supplier in business as well during this really difficult time. Really important to get your 5 a day, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. NHS workers are getting lots of cakes, they need fruit too. And the second thing that I want to highlight, or rather give a shout out to, is Sharon, who works at the is it the Ministry of Defence, I think?
Sharon Amanosaher, yeah. She's the MOD infrastructure lead.
Yeah, she's been doing isolation art for the last 2 months so far. She's been drawing something every single day. And if you follow her on Twitter, her artwork is absolutely phenomenal. And she's been taking requests, just of people, just with what people have been missing, or like a really important place to them. And last week she drew Cape Town for me, which is a really important place to me. I go to South Africa most years. And it was just such a delight to see. And at the moment she is raising money for the Royal Armed Forces charity. And so if you do appreciate her artwork, if you do enjoy it as much as I do, and as much as a lot of people on Twitter are enjoying it, it's really gained such recognition, but it's truly beautiful as well. Please do support the charity and her work. I think it's such a nice thing to do, and it's just brought so much joy to me as well.
Thank you very much, Priya. Jenny, I'll come to you next, and then last to Juliet.
Yeah, I just want to give a really big shout out for the Unite Foundation. So this is a charity that Unite students started 8 years ago to give full accommodation scholarships to students who don't have a secure home otherwise. So they're usually care leavers, they're estranged from their parents, some are forced migrants as well. And so right from the beginning of this crisis, the foundation team have been on the phone, on email to all of the students that we're supporting at the moment, just checking in, what do they need, providing them with what they need. And at the same time, the director, Eleanor, who is fabulous, she's been working with a group of other charities, just lobbying government to provide additional support to more generally students who are from a care background or who are estranged.
Thank you. Juliet?
I was also going to mention Sharon as well, because her artwork's been a real high point in these days of isolation. But I'll give a shout out to the Lionheart board, because they've been amazingly supportive of the staff team at Lionheart. They acted quickly to support us, the executive team, to deliver services. So in the first week, we were already delivering grants to people who had changed jobs the wrong side of what was then a very arbitrary furlough deadline. They just met whenever we've needed them to support us with decision making around moving funds and flexing our grant programs, and enabled us to deliver support to the surveying community from the word go. So it's been they've been great.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all of my panellists for joining us for this conversation around mental health in Mental Health Week. I hope we've been honest and open about the challenges, but also focused on some real positives that we can and should and must take from the COVID experience, and reflected a little bit on some of the longer term issues too. So thank you to all of my panel. Thank you to you for joining us, and we will see you again soon. Thank you.